Long before Chris Kyle became the most feared sniper in U.S. military history, he was just a boy, growing up under the scorching Texas sun. Born in Odessa in 1974, Chris was raised in a conservative, hard-working family. His father, a stern yet loving man, taught him early on that the world was divided into three kinds of people: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. "You're a sheepdog," his father told him, looking him straight in the eyes. "You protect." Chris wasn't the toughest kid in school nor the loudest, but he was steady, loyal, and precise. His childhood was built on discipline: early mornings, hard chores, church on Sundays, and hunting trips with his father. It was during those long, silent hours in the woods, rifle in hand, that Chris developed an uncanny patience and deadly aim. He didn't know it then, but those quiet moments would shape the kind of man and warrior he'd one day become. Rodeos were a major part of his early life. He dreamed of being a professional cowboy, living a life on the open range. But fate had other plans. After high school, Chris worked as a ranch hand, riding horses and breaking bulls. The pay was low, but the grit was real. He loved the dirt, the sweat, the honesty of it all. But deep inside, something else stirred, a calling, something that went beyond fences and cattle. A sense that his strength, his focus, his unshakable calm under pressure were meant for something more, something greater, something dangerous. And then, the world changed. After the 9/11 attacks, Chris Kyle knew the world would never be the same, and neither would he. Like millions of Americans, he watched in horror as the Twin Towers fell. But unlike most, he didn't just feel anger, he felt responsibility. That moment ignited something dormant inside him. He wasn't going to sit back and watch. He was going to serve. At the time, Chris was already in his late 20s, working as a ranch hand and doing rodeos on the side, but the call to action was stronger than his dreams of cowboy life. He walked into a Navy recruiting office and asked to join. Initially, he was turned away. An old rodeo injury to his arm disqualified him, but fate wasn't finished with him. Days later, the Navy called back. They were willing to take a chance. Chris accepted without hesitation. What followed was one of the most grueling military training programs on Earth, BUD-S, the Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. Designed to break the body and test the soul, BUD-S doesn't just produce soldiers, it forges warriors. Chris was pushed to his absolute limit: cold water, endless push-ups, brutal sleep deprivation, and relentless mental stress. But Kyle endured. He didn't just survive, he proved that pain couldn't crack his resolve. Among the trainees, he stood out. Not for his size or speed, but for something deeper. A stillness, a focus. While others panicked or quit, Chris observed. He listened, he waited. Every shot he took was calculated, every breath controlled. He was becoming what the military needed most: a sniper who wouldn't flinch under fire. By the time he graduated, he had earned his place among the Navy SEALs, the most elite fighting force on the planet. He wasn't a cowboy anymore. He was now a warrior forged by discipline and sharpened by purpose, and his war was just beginning. The sands of Iraq were unforgiving: blinding sun, choking dust, and the constant echo of gunfire. Chris Kyle was deployed for his first tour in 2003, in the early days of Operation Iraqi Freedom. His team was sent into the heart of urban warfare: Fallujah, Ramadi, Baghdad. Cities transformed into battlegrounds, streets into killing zones. On the very first mission, Chris was positioned on a rooftop overlooking a narrow alley where U.S. Marines were patrolling. His orders were clear: protect them at all costs. And then he saw her. A woman in a black robe, moving quickly toward the soldiers. In her hand, something small, metallic, tucked beneath her sleeve. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the crosshairs hovering on her chest. Was she a threat? Could she be bluffing? That hesitation could cost lives. Chris pulled the trigger. The woman dropped instantly. A second later, the object rolled from her hand. It was a grenade. That single shot saved the entire unit below. It was his first confirmed kill, and it would haunt him for years. From that moment on, Kyle became something else. Not just a SEAL, not just a sniper, but a protector, silent, unseen, watching from above. In Ramadi, he became a ghost. Insurgents feared him so much they placed a $20,000 bounty on his head. They called him the Devil of Ramadi. To the Marines he covered, he was simply a guardian angel. Chris learned to read every movement on the battlefield. The twitch of a finger, the glance of an eye, the nervous shift of weight. He knew when someone was about to run, to shoot, to die, and he responded with terrifying precision. But even for a warrior of his caliber, the weight of war began to press in. Each life taken added a new scar. But he pushed through. Mission after mission, rooftop after rooftop, he kept going. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the men on the ground who depended on him. The enemy never saw him, but they felt him. And for every Marine who walked out alive, Kyle was the reason. And yet this was only the beginning. The numbers would rise, the legend would grow. And Chris Kyle was about to become the deadliest sniper in American history. As the war dragged on, so did Chris Kyle's missions. He became a constant shadow in the cities of Iraq, a ghost with a rifle, feared by the enemy, trusted by every man he protected. With each tour, his kill count rose. 100, 150, 160 confirmed kills. Unofficially, that number may have exceeded 250. No American sniper had ever come close. But for Chris, it was never about the numbers. Every shot he took was a decision, a moral, emotional weight. Not every target was holding a weapon. Some hid grenades under robes, others waited until the last second to draw, and in a war where hesitation meant death, Chris learned to trust his instincts. He became a master of anticipation, reading the battlefield like a chessboard, always 3 moves ahead. There were legendary moments that spread like wildfire through the ranks. One of his most famous shots came from over 2,100 yards away, nearly 1.2 miles. A man was about to fire an RPG at a convoy. Chris exhaled, steadied, fired. The target collapsed seconds later. It was one of the longest confirmed kills in history, but Kyle never bragged. He carried it like all the others, silently, respectfully. What separated him wasn't just his precision, but his purpose. He wasn't killing for country, medals, or vengeance. He was killing to protect. He saw himself as a shield. "I would lay down my life for my brothers," he once said. "And I'd take 100 lives to keep one of them breathing." But that kind of purpose comes at a cost. The more lives he saved, the more lives he had to take. Each mission left him more withdrawn. Nights were longer. Sleep became shallow. He started to carry ghosts, not just of those he'd taken, but of the ones he couldn't save. Still, he returned. Again and again. 4 tours in total. His name became legend. Insurgents passed it in whispers. U.S. generals called for his deployment in key zones. His presence alone boosted morale. But back home, something inside Chris was shifting. What had once been clear, good guys, bad guys, right and wrong, was starting to blur. And though he could shoot with absolute precision, he couldn't escape. What was building inside him? His war in Iraq was nearing its end, but the battle waiting for him at home was just beginning. When Chris Kyle returned home from his final tour, the battlefield didn't stay behind. It came with him. Iraq was thousands of miles away, but the war echoed in his mind like it had never ended. Crowds made him anxious. Loud noises sent him on edge. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't relax. He couldn't forget. His wife, Taya, welcomed him with open arms, but the man who walked through the door wasn't the same man who left. He was quiet, distant, always watching, always alert, like a predator waiting for danger to strike. She tried to reach him, to pull him back into the world they once shared. But Chris had brought a different world with him, one filled with ghosts and guilt. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a silent killer. It doesn't scream, it whispers, it chips away at identity, corrodes joy, and isolates even the strongest. For Chris, the battlefield had rules. At home, there were none. In combat, he knew who the enemy was. In civilian life, everything felt uncertain, blurry, wrong. He tried to rejoin normal life, taking his kids to school, doing interviews, even writing his memoir. But every moment felt hollow. The media praised him, politicians honored him, but what he really wanted was peace. Then something shifted. Chris found meaning again, not in fame, not in recognition, but in service. He began working with wounded, veterans, men and women, carrying the same invisible scars. He took them to the shooting range, not to glorify war, but to create a space where they could talk, breathe, and heal. On the range, they didn't have to explain. Chris understood. In that silence between shots, healing began. He became a lifeline for dozens of former soldiers. His mission was no longer to kill, it was to save. He spoke at events, met with struggling vets, and slowly the heavy fog began to lift. But healing is not linear, and trauma doesn't follow a schedule. There were still nights filled with panic, days clouded by memories he wished he could erase. But for the first time in years, Chris Kyle had found a new war worth fighting. And this time, he wasn't alone. He was reclaiming his peace, one conversation at a time. But fate had one final ambush waiting. Chris Kyle had survived 4 tours. In Iraq, he'd faced snipers, ambushes, and explosions. He'd walked through hell and come back breathing. But it wasn't war that ended his life. It was a moment of trust on American soil. On February 2nd, 2013, Chris agreed to do what he had done so many times before: help a fellow veteran in need. His name was Eddie Ray Ruth, a 25-year-old Marine, struggling with PTSD. Chris didn't hesitate. Along with his friend Chad Littlefield, he invited Eddie to the Rough Creek Lodge shooting range in Texas, a place where Chris often brought veterans to heal. But something was wrong. Eddie was quiet. Distant, paranoid, still Chris stayed calm. He believed in second chances, in the healing power of purpose, but that belief would cost him everything. At the range, without warning, Eddie pulled out a handgun and opened fire. Chris was shot multiple times. Chad, too. Both men died on the spot. 2 warriors, 2 fathers, 2 lives cut down, not by war, but by the very pain they were trying to ease. The news shook the nation. The man who had survived the deadliest corners of the Middle East was gone, killed by someone he was trying to save. It didn't seem fair. It didn't make sense. Flags were lowered, tributes poured in. Thousands lined the highways during his funeral procession. At Cowboy Stadium, where his memorial was held, not a single seat was empty. For many, Chris Kyle was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of service, of sacrifice, of strength wrapped in silence. His death was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder. Some battles follow our heroes home, and some wounds run so deep they infect everything they touch. Eddie Ray Ruth was later found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But justice could never fill the void Chris left behind. He was a husband, a father, a protector, to the end. And in that final act of service, he gave everything he had. Chris Kyle may have fallen, but his legacy never stopped rising. After his death, the world didn't just mourn a soldier, it remembered a man who gave everything he had. For others, his autobiography, American Sniper, became a national bestseller, opening a raw and honest window into the life of a warrior. In 2014, Clint Eastwood brought his story to the big screen, with Bradley Cooper in the lead role. The film American Sniper shattered box office records, sparking conversations across the globe. But beyond books and movies, something more important took root. Taya Kyle, his wife, carried on his mission. She founded the Chris Kyle Frog Foundation, dedicated to supporting military and first responder families. Through counseling, retreats, and support programs, the foundation became a safe harbor for those fighting invisible wars, just like Chris once did. His name now adorns schools, roads, and memorials, but his truest legacy lives in the soldiers he saved, in the families he protected, in the lives he touched without ever meeting them. For many, Chris Kyle represents the best of America, not perfection but purpose, not invincibility but integrity. A man who didn't see himself as a hero but lived like one anyway. He once wrote, "I'm not the best shot, I'm just willing to take the shot." That humility, that courage is what made him unforgettable. Because in the end, heroes aren't remembered for how many enemies they defeat, but for how many lives they protect. And Chris Kyle protected them all. Chris Kyle's story isn't just one of war, it's one of honor, sacrifice, and the invisible battles that so many veterans continue to face every day. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on what real heroism looks like. It's not always flashy, it's not about medals. Sometimes it's about carrying the weight of others when they can no longer walk alone. Leave a comment below. What did you learn from Chris Kyle's journey? Do you believe his story changed the way the world sees its warriors? And if you want more powerful real-life stories of courage and resilience, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.